As Erwan said, I've been involved, especially over the last 15 years or so, a lot in international assessments of both climate change and biodiversity, working both in the context of the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and IPBES. So I suspect, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that you either have already heard a lot about climate change or you will hear a lot about climate change in ALCAN, given what it's about. And so I'm going to be focusing more on biodiversity, and especially the relationships between biodiversity and climate change. And I'm not going to be spending very much time on climate change, assuming that either you know it already or you'll know it soon. So I worked in the context of the IPCC. I think most of you either know it or you will know a lot about it fairly soon. I've also worked a lot with IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So it's the equivalent of the IPCC, but focusing on biodiversity and ecosystem service issues. And just a little bit of background, what do the IPCC and IPBES do? They bring together a large number of scientists from all over the world to provide expertise on climate change, biodiversity, and ecosystem services to governments. And it's a very particular context because it's the governments that request that information from scientists, scientists provide it to them, and then governments actually then adopt the conclusions of the scientists following a discussion between scientists and governments about the main messages that come out from their expertise. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about things that have come out from two of these very recent expertise. One is the IPBES Global Assessment, which was a global assessment of the state of biodiversity and ecosystem services at the global scale, and a joint report for the first time ever that was done between IPBES and IPCC, looking at the interactions between biodiversity and climate change. And so if you're, especially that's what I'm going to be focusing on, and so if you're really interested in this relationship between biodiversity and climate change, that's a great place to start. What am I going to be talking about? The first thing I want to do is just give a real brief overview of the sort of big crises, which are the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and talk a little bit about how they interact in a very broad sense, and then dig a lot deeper into climate change impacts on biodiversity. So how much is climate change impacting biodiversity? How is biodiversity important, and can it play an important role in climate mitigation? Thirdly, can it play an important role in climate adaptation? So we know we're going to have climate change, so we also need to prepare now for adapting to inevitable climate change. The climate's going to warm at least 1.5 degrees by 2040, 2050, and probably more. So what are the synergies and especially some of the negative impacts of climate mitigation and adaptation strategies on biodiversity? So there's a lot of thinking that's going into about how we're going to do climate mitigation, how we're going to do climate adaptation. There was a lot of talk about that this year in particular, and a lot of those things are really bad for biodiversity. Some of them are good, many of them are good, but there's lots of things that people are thinking about that are really bad for biodiversity. And if it's bad for biodiversity, there may even be a feedback on that where being bad for biodiversity is in the end run bad for the climate. Then taking a look at some of the actions that we can have on the indirect drivers. So what I mean by indirect drivers, how those things related to the way our society functions, our modes of consumption and production, how can we change those things so that they benefit both climate and biodiversity at the same time? And then talk a little bit about both collective and individual action that fits into those things that we can do that benefit climate and biodiversity. So I'm going to do a first part. I think I'll do the first couple parts of that in English, maybe go down all the way to the synergy, so the climate biodiversity mitigation and adaptation, and then we'll take a little break and I'll switch into French. Don't hesitate to stop me if I start talking too fast. Don't hesitate to stop me if there's something you didn't understand, and certainly don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question if it's about something that you're interested in and you'd like a little bit more detail or a little bit more discussion of it. So don't hesitate to raise your hand, jump in. The first thing to do, as I said, is I just want to give you this really broad brush overview of the climate and biodiversity crises. And the climate crisis, I'm not going to spend much time on, under the hypothesis, based on the hypothesis that they're going to see a lot of that. They had Valérie-Masson, perfect. Great. If you had Valérie-Masson, I'm not going to repeat lots of things that she said about where climate is headed and how difficult. I assume she went over things like how difficult it is going to be to halt climate change at 1.5 degrees, and on current commitments for climate mitigation, we're headed more like towards 3 degrees, maybe more. So instead of doing that, I just made this personal, and maybe you've got your own personal experience with climate change. Wow, there's a lot of light on there. You don't see that slide very well. So that's myself and my daughter. Actually, before she was born, I skied down the Mer de Glace, which is way down at the bottom of that very, very, very long flight of stairs. And where I'm standing there is where we arrived on skis when I skied that in 1990. And it was just a short flight of stairs. You put your skis on your shoulder, you walked up to the train and took the train down to Chamonix. Can't do that anymore. It's so far down to the glacier now, they've actually put in téléphérique so that you can get up there, because it's just an incredibly long flight of stairs. And this summer has been terrible for glaciers. I mean, they've just really, really badly melted throughout large parts of Europe. So that's just a personal experience. There's plenty of things that you can see around you, and this year was a really good example of that are evidence of climate change. And so I'm not going to get into that. This is just an example of how big the impacts of climate change can be. That glacier has retreated hundreds of meters. There are other glaciers that have retreated even more than that, and that will continue. And many small glaciers have either already disappeared or will disappear in the future. And those are just going to have huge ecological consequences and social consequences for us. So I'm not going to spend time on that. Just climate change is a reality, and it's big. And I'm going to focus more on the biodiversity part. So that's the one big crisis, and we spend a lot of time in the media and politics talking about climate change mitigation and adaptation this year because of problems with fires and everything else. And unfortunately, we lost a little bit sight of the second crisis, which is the biodiversity crisis. And when the IPBES assessment came out in 2019, it had a really big impact in the media, and there was a lot of attention being paid to biodiversity. And because we've lost sight of that, I want to just come back and really insist on the biodiversity crisis. And I'm going to, maybe I don't have enough slides here. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more than perhaps is here. So what is the biodiversity crisis? So biodiversity is declining at global scales. So roughly a quarter of the species that have been studied on the planet are at risk of extinction. And that's data that's reasonably well understood. It's the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that has experts that go out and study animal and plant populations and tries to estimate the degree of risk of extinction. And so that's actually a pretty good set of data. Roughly about a quarter of the species that we've studied, not a quarter of the species on the planet, but a quarter of the species we've studied, and we've studied tens of thousands of them, are at risk of extinction. Another set of data that we have is the size of populations of mostly animals, mostly in the northern hemisphere, and they're declining globally. They're not declining everywhere at the same speed. The populations of animals in particular are declining very, very rapidly, especially in South America and in Southeast Asia. And they're actually much more stable in North America and large parts of Western Europe. So we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, and what's driving that crisis? So I shouldn't have put this slide up before asking that question, because now you know the answer. So what would you have said before I showed this slide? Well, interestingly enough, a lot of people will answer pollution. A lot of people will answer climate change. Yes, go ahead. Deforestation. Okay? That fits into this large category. So these different colors are the different. So we typically break down all the things that are driving biodiversity loss into 5 main categories. Land and sea use change, of which deforestation is a really important one. Direct exploitation, which is overfishing, overexploitation of wild species, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. So some people might answer climate change because we talk so much about climate change and we talk about climate change impacts on biodiversity. There are big impacts of climate change on biodiversity already, and I'll show you some of that, but it's not now the most important driver of biodiversity loss. It's land and sea use change. And so one of those is deforestation. And why do we deforest? What's driving deforestation? Yes? Yep. So the primary thing driving deforestation is what we call commodity-driven deforestation. So it's either for timber, but a really big fraction of it is to produce food, either to feed us directly, but unfortunately most of it to feed animals so that we can then eat animals. And we'll get back to that later. So the major driver here is on terrestrial ecosystems is land use change. Major driver, the primary driver in marine ecosystems, and it's really important to keep in mind that those are 2 very different systems, is direct exploitation. And what's direct exploitation? What's driving that? Fishing for food. So we're back to the same cause, that is, lots of deforestation is being driven by our need for food, and lots of what's happening in terms of biodiversity loss in the oceans is being driven by our need for food. In freshwater, it's mostly about not land and sea use change, or you can think of freshwater as part of land. That has a lot to do with the way that we're managing water systems, building dams, putting rivers in channels, changing the flow of rivers, and so that's having a big impact on freshwater ecosystems. And it is very interesting that in terrestrial ecosystems, and I think that's a surprise for many people, that pollution is an important driver. Shouldn't neglect pollution, but it's not the primary driver of biodiversity change in terrestrial ecosystems. That might seem obvious, but when the 2019 report came out of IPBES, we went to present it to Elisabeth Born, who was actually the environmental minister at that point, and she didn't know that land use change was the primary driver of biodiversity in terrestrial ecosystems. So maybe she shouldn't have known that, maybe she should have, but at any rate, it shows you the extent to which the public and politicians are unaware of these fairly straightforward facts about what's driving the biodiversity crisis. So maybe another detail that doesn't jump out there, these are sort of really broad brush things. What is the factor that's driving extinctions of vertebrates at global scale, especially birds? What's the primary factor that's driving the extinction of birds at global scale? Cats. Yep, bingo. Got it. Cats, rats, snakes, invasive animal species. So one has to keep in mind this is very broad brush here, and that the things that are driving different parts of biodiversity for different in different places of the planet are very, very different. So bird species are primarily being driven extinct on small islands by cats, rats, snakes, mongoose, and other invasive species. So always keep in mind when you see the biodiversity crisis being talked about that we do have a global crisis that's really important, but the way that it manifests itself at local scales is very, very different. And so in the Paris region, perhaps, I don't know this is a fact, perhaps the major driver of biodiversity loss is urbanization. No comment being made about where we are sitting right now. Just so let's zoom in this and look at what's driving terrestrial biodiversity loss in Europe. So this was an assessment that was done by the European Environmental Assessment Agency. And what they're doing is they looked at many different groups, many different levels of biodiversity, different groups of species, looking at different habitats, looking at what was driving degradation and loss of habitats, or was looking at non-bird species and bird species, and looking at what was driving not so much extinctions, but maybe local extinctions and declines in population. So then up on top, you have the main drivers of terrestrial biodiversity loss. And I think that also comes to a surprise to many people, although perhaps it shouldn't. The size of the square and whether it's dark red or yellow indicates whether it's a major driver or a small driver of biodiversity loss. And so agriculture is the primary driver of terrestrial biodiversity loss in Europe, like it is at the planet, like it is at many local scales. And I think many times that's not well understood, that agriculture and fishing, so the things that we produce, food that we eat, are the primary drivers of biodiversity loss at many scales. Now, of course, that can be different. In some local places, you can have pollution, or you can have urbanization, or other things that are driving biodiversity loss. But at global scales, European scales, and many regional scales in France, you're getting biodiversity loss in terrestrial ecosystems being driven by agriculture. So what is it about agriculture that's driving biodiversity loss here in Europe? So this is a little closer to home. You don't have to think about deforestation in Brazil or in Southeast Asia, which is also being driven by what we eat because we import food from there, but think about it in Europe. Yes? So conventional agriculture is creating a lot of pollution. Okay, but what's killing the small insects? Pesticides. So, okay, one of the things that's driving, one of the reasons that agriculture is driving biodiversity loss is pesticides that are killing insects. So there's now reasonably good evidence that there are very strong declines of insect populations in Europe. There's evidence that it comes from pesticides. What else might be killing insects in Europe related to agriculture? In French or in English? Yep. Yeah. So we're growing very simple, we're creating very simple landscapes. So insects insects do best, well, insect pests do really well in monocultures. That's why we have to use so many pesticides. But insects, in a larger sense, need a high diversity of plants. And in Europe, we've done a very good job of turning agricultural landscapes into biodiversity deserts. We've ripped out hedges. So we ripped out 700,000 kilometers or 7 million kilometers of hedges over the last couple of decades. I have the number somewhere and I forget it. We're still ripping out 11,000 kilometers of hedges now, even though we've now got programs to replace them, but we're only replacing at about 7,000 kilometers per year. So we're still ripping out hedges faster than we put them in. Drive around, you'll see plenty of fields where they're just plowing right up to the edges of the roads and there are no hedges between any of them. So that's just one example. We've done just a really great job of simplifying landscapes. And so we've got two effects, one which is really important, which are pesticides, and the other one is removing biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. And at this point, we know that they both play a role, but we don't know exactly how much each one of those plays. Now, some people, I don't know if you follow Stéphane Foucault in Le Monde, would like us to believe that it's 100% pesticides, and if as a scientist we say anything else than that, we're just working for the pesticide industry. The reality of it is the insect decline is complicated and it's probably being driven by multiple factors, including things like too much light, simplifying landscapes, way too many pesticides, and a multiplicity of factors. And then the comment was exactly right. Less insects, less things that eat insects, and you just have this whole chain of negative impacts of agriculture on biodiversity. And that is why we get to the next slide, which was nicely anticipated by the comment. The biodiversity crisis is, and it's really, really important because some people sell the biodiversity crisis as in, just everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And that's not true. And if you tell people that and they see things that are different, because it is different, then they'll have a hard time relating what you say about the biodiversity crisis to reality. And here's a really great example of it. This is the size of populations of different groups of birds in France. And what you see on top is the black line. Those are generalist species. So what is a generalist species? A generalist species is that it can use forest, it can use urban areas, it can use kind of abandoned areas all pretty well. And you look at the line of their population. So one is the relative size of the population in 1990, and you can see that curve there. They're actually doing okay. Why? They get along well with people. We make more scrubby areas, they're happy with that. You make more urban areas, as long as you've got enough things in your garden, they're happy with that. And so their populations are actually doing reasonably well. Look at the birds in forests, milieu forestier. So that's the green line. So there's a little bit of decline after the 1990s, but it's pretty much stabilized. What's going on there? Why is that stabilized? Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Actually, if you look at France and even at the European scale, forest area is actually increasing. Now, it's not all great forest, so if some of that is conifer plant, monospecific, monogenetic conifer plantations, which is not great for biodiversity. But basically, there's more forest than there was a couple of decades ago. And you can still use pesticides in forests, but it's not nearly so widely spread as in agriculture areas. So birds are doing okay there. So saying that, biodiversity is just declining everywhere in France is not true, at least for birds. Where is it declining? That's the yellow line. And actually, that yellow line has taken a dive since I last made this graph. Those are birds like this perdrix grise that you find in agricultural areas. Now, we have a pretty good idea of why that's declining. It does really well in permanent pastures where it can find lots of insects, and probably the overuse of pesticides is also killing lots of insects, and so they don't have much to eat, and so their populations are declining. Yep. Yeah, looks very similar. Yep. And not so, it looks a little bit different in North America, for example, but it's not so different. And bottom line is the same. We're simplifying agricultural landscapes, putting on lots of pesticides. That tends to kill insects, and a lot of these birds that are characteristic of these agricultural landscapes eat insects. Yeah. Of birds, most of these birds are not hunted. So there are problems with some birds being hunted, but most of these birds, hunting's not weighing on their population size. You're not allowed to shoot them. So actually, there's another interesting point. Large-bodied birds, most large-bodied birds, including some of the ones that are hunted in France against European law, their population sizes are actually increasing. And it's really interesting. It's the sort of large group of birds, large-bodied birds, hawks, eagles, geese, their populations are actually increasing. If you look at the total biomass of birds in Europe, it's actually increasing. And what's happening is small birds are tending to decline a lot, and big birds are doing really well. And for the most part, with some exceptions in France, it's because we stopped shooting them or poisoning them. And actually did some active reintroduction for some of them. Yeah. Not so much. Most of them are, that's not the reason for the strong declines that you're seeing here. So there is some competition, but it's not the primary reason that you're seeing these declines here. The really big declines are in the agricultural species, and that's pretty uniform across body size. So, how many of these species have gone extinct, either here or in the rest of Europe? So that when we talk about the biodiversity crisis, we also talk about an extinction crisis. Can somebody give me the name of a species that has gone extinct in Europe over the last 2 decades? You can't. That's because there have been almost no extinctions, and as far as I know, no bird extinctions in Europe over the last couple of decades. So we talk a lot about the extinction crisis, and there is an extinction crisis, but it's not where we live. So we basically killed off all the animals well, maybe we're still working on it, but we basically killed off the animals. So in France, we hunted the bears to extinction. We hunted wolves to extinction in France. Fortunately, they didn't go extinct on their entire range, so they could recolonize, well, not bears yet, but so they could recolonize France. But we did a really great job of making all big animals, especially, go extinct, because we didn't get along with them. We shot them, killed them, trapped them, poisoned them until they were gone. So we're basically left with those things that more or less can manage to live with us. And it's also important to keep in mind that the biodiversity crisis looks different. I really insist on that the biodiversity crisis looks different for different groups of animals in different places. So we hunted beavers in Europe almost to extinction. They estimate there were only about 1,000 beavers in all of Europe in the early 1900s because it was trapped for fur and basically hunted almost to extinction. I mean, that's such a small population, it's amazing they come back. We're now about 1.2 million, and beavers were first sighted just a few years ago in the Paris region. So the beavers are back. And it's really simple. You stop poisoning them, you stop shooting them, you stop destroying their dams, blowing up their dams, doing things like that to beavers. You do some reintroduction. That's the picture that you can't see on your right there. You do some reintroductions and left many species, not all, many species, if you give them a chance, they can come back. And we're seeing that. Another example are whales. We hunted many whale populations almost to extinction. We stopped, except for the Japanese and a few others. And most whale populations, not all, most whale populations are coming back. Some recent estimates suggest that humpback whale populations were almost hunted to extinction should be back to pre-fishing populations in the next couple of decades. So it's not always that straightforward, and it's going to be a lot harder with climate change, and I'll get to that. But basically, we know what we need to do. Okay. So. I'll finish this first introductory part with a diagram that I don't like, but it came from the best IPCC report, so I'm going to use it. And don't read anything on it. Just other than the labels, it's a biodiversity, climate change, and good quality of life. The only message that I want you to take home from this is those three things interact with each other. When you change climate, it's influencing biodiversity. When you change biodiversity, it's influencing climate. When you change climate, it's influencing our quality of life. And when we change biodiversity, it's influencing our quality of life. So those things are intimately related, and we're not treating those crises like they were completely related. And it's a huge problem. So we have the IPCC on one side that's worrying about climate, and they do worry about biodiversity a little bit. We've got IPBES that mostly worries about the biodiversity crisis. And then you have a whole bunch of other people who worry about well-being, human well-being, and both of those, I best worry about that a little bit, but they don't necessarily talk to each other all the time. And then if you go to thinking about international commitments to things, we have the UNFCCC, which is what we call the Climate Change Convention, and they basically only look at climate change. And you have the Convention on Biological Diversity that more or less only looks at biodiversity, and I work a lot with the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're in the midst of negotiating the next set of international targets for biodiversity. There are many countries that do not want the CBD to talk or say anything about climate change because that's negotiations to had in the context of the Convention on Climate Change. So we've got these crises that are intimately related, and we're doing a very poor job of linking them together. And so that's the next part of what I want to talk about is how these things are related and why we've got to treat these crises as if they were fundamentally and intimately related. So that's where I'm going to go next. And the first part of that is that climate change is not currently the major driver of biodiversity, but it's an important one, and will be perhaps the primary driver of biodiversity loss and change in the not too distant future. So one of the things that we do in our institute, EDEV, is we look at these are trees. I know you can't see the picture here very well, but those are trees, and they're dead. This is actually a picture from the Fontainebleau forest, and you're looking at a bunch of dead conifers that died from drought and heat stress. And I don't know if any of you, there was a show on last night about forests in France. I don't know if anybody saw that other than me. Okay. A great show on forests in France, talking a lot about how mistreated our forests are in France, but also about climate change in France. And this year, I think as we look back at it, we're going to see this as one of the worst years ever for forests in France. It was very hot, very dry, and a lot of trees really suffered from it. And there's a real concern that we're going to have real problems with our forests everywhere on the planet, but including in France because of climate change. And we see signs of that already. So there's relatively little doubt that climate change is going to cause some real problems with the future of our forests. You'll talk about that at some point, Nathalie, and you're not giving class, okay. And it's a complicated story that's related both directly to the direct climate change impacts on forests, so through the fact that they have a hard time tolerating drought and extreme heat. So that's one of the things that's killing forests, but it's complicated by the fact that it's also increasing their vulnerability to fire, and we certainly saw plenty of evidence of that this summer. So this summer looks, and Natalie will correct me here if I say something, this summer looks a lot like what they're predicting summers will look like on a pretty regular basis in the future. So this is pretty much what the future looks like this summer, and that's a lot of forest fires, a lot of trees in really serious drought stress. And those fires are hard to predict, so we don't really know what. We know that they're probably going to be more of a problem, and they're going to be a problem for forests, but we don't really know exactly what. And even more of a concern is that insect pests are becoming a really big problem, and a lot of that's related to climate change. So the trees are weakened and they become more vulnerable to insects, but also insects can invade new areas that they couldn't be in before because of increasing temperature. And a really nice example of this, and this is actually one of the examples that the French climate change, whatever it's called, uses as its indicator, is a biological indicator of climate change. And these are chenilles précessionnaires, so they're caterpillars that attack mostly conifer trees. And in 1972, that blue line there, their range was south of that blue line. So for those people who know the geography of France, Orléans is about 100 kilometers south of Paris. So they were limited to that. And they were probably limited to that by cold winter temperatures. So they don't tolerate really hard freezing temperatures in the wintertime. The overwintering moths don't. Then in 2004, they were started to be up near where I live. And in 2018, their distribution was well north of Paris. So now we can't be sure for this species. It could have been something else. Maybe people are helping move it around or things like that. But since this is happening to insect species all over the world, and that signal is very similar for lots of insect populations all over the world, they tend to be moving towards the poles and up in altitude as it warms, just like we would predict. So we can make a reasonable assumption that what's driving that are warmer winters. And that has major impacts on conifers. So where I live, there used to be none of these when I first moved to the Paris region, and now every single conifer tree in our village has this little ring around it in the middle of the tree, so where they've put up these traps that capture these caterpillars. So that's fine. You can do that when it's in your backyard. When it's out in the forest, it becomes very difficult to control these. And they can do a pretty good job of defoliating conifer trees and helping kill them. So now that's pretty small scale compared to what's happening in Canada, where you're getting massive, large-scale dieback of forests due to insects moving north and destroying hundreds, thousands of square kilometers of pine forests. And one of the important things that we do so what I just showed you always poses these problems. We're seeing something that just happens to be one individual insect or one individual tree species? Is there a lot of generality to this in terms of looking at many species and especially globally? You know, there might be special things that are happening in France that aren't happening elsewhere. And one of the roles that the IPCC plays and IPBES plays is to try and extract sort of the generalities of what's happening. And so this is one of the maps that we published. It's been updated in the most recent IPCC report. We published this way back in 2014. And it was looking at all the locations in the world where we'd seen climate-related tree dieback, either dots or very large areas. So you can see there's actually evidence where these circles are of relatively large areas of tree dieback in the Amazon forest, in the south of Europe, in southern Sahel. And again, any single one of those, you can't be absolutely sure that it was climate change that drove the tree dieback. But when you start to be looking at a signal that's really strong because the same thing's happening all over the world, we begin to have pretty good evidence that climate change is driving tree dieback. And it's a bit of a surprise because at the same time we're increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. That's one of the reasons that temperatures are rising. And rising CO2 is actually good for trees. It helps them do photosynthesis. It helps them transpire, lose less water. And some scientists were predicting that that increase in CO2 concentration in the atmosphere the benefits of that would outweigh the negative impacts of climate change. And in fact, until very recently in France, the productivity of trees was increasing. So if you looked over the long term at the productivity of beech or oaks, it was actually increasing as a function of time. And that was attributed to increasing temperature actually being beneficial for them, to nitrogen fertilizer. So it's a whole nother subject, but we put a lot of nitrogen into the atmosphere and it falls back on forests and other natural ecosystems and it fertilizes them. So we're in the midst of fertilizing Europe at this point with nitrogen. So you've got nitrogen fertilizer, you've got warmer temperatures but not too hot, and rising CO2 concentrations, which stimulates photosynthesis, and all those three things together were actually increasing forest productivity in France. That's actually, for some species, slowed down or even turned around. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so both the species of the trees and the age of the trees has a huge impact in terms of their resistance to climate change and the response to those different factors. And so if we take the case in the Amazon forest, it's mostly the really big, older trees that are dying. So, but much earlier than they had been before. So it's not that they're just getting old and dying. They're dying much sooner than we would have expected them to based on previous observations. So there is a really big age component to how they respond to climate change. Oh, gosh. I always hate to show this slide because it's depressing. The most sensitive ecosystem probably on the planet, and we know this from the history of the planet, the first thing to go with climate change on the planet are coral reefs. And if there was ever, in English we call it a canary in a coal mine. It's the same expression in French, I believe. No. So anyway, a canary in a coal mine is the coal miners always used to have a little bird with them, and when the bird died, it was much more sensitive to poisonous gases and reduction in oxygen in the mines, and when the canary died, you knew you were in trouble. Well, that's what we've got with coral reefs. They're dying all over the planet, and that's due to multiple causes. So destructive fishing, pollution coming in from terrestrial ecosystems, but now this is the ecosystem where the primary driver of biodiversity loss is climate change. So here you are, this is in 2018, there was a massive bleaching event in Australia, which is one of the largest and reasonably well-protected coral reefs in the world. And essentially what happens is when the water temperature gets too hot, the corals are little animals, and they have an algae that's associated with them symbiotically. And when they get too hot, they get rid of the algae, and that makes them very fragile. And if they can't be recolonized by algae, and they've just been overheated too much, then they die. And so about a third of the corals died in this heat wave off of Australia. And we're in the midst of, there was one last year again. And this is just one example of coral reefs really being devastated at planetary scales. And that's a really, really clear climate change signal. And what's really interesting is that when you go back in the history of the Earth, corals are the first to go with climate change. They're a really, really sensitive ecosystem. The other sensitive ecosystem that's very interesting and where we're really seeing huge climate change effects for different reasons are in polar regions, especially the Arctic. Now that's because they're not, corals, this is happening in corals because they're super sensitive to increasing temperature and also to ocean acidification. Arctic ecosystems are being heavily impacted because it's just so hot. So in some places in Alaska, where I did my PhD thesis, average temperatures are running 5 degrees above normal for a year. So I mean, you're just temperatures that are just way above temperatures that, so the planetary average is around, over terrestrial ecosystems, we're a little bit over 1 degree now. Yeah. Oh, more than 1.6, okay. But in Alaska, it's just, parts of Alaska is just way above that. And so they are sensitive in the sense that there are, especially the far northern ecosystems are on permafrost, so the ground is permanently frozen. So they're sensitive in the fact that when you warm them up, then the soils thaw, and that causes really big changes in these ecosystems. And since it's warmed up so much, in some places, you're getting these really big impacts. And just a last slide before we take a short pause. One of the important things to keep in mind is that the impacts of climate change on biodiversity do change with the increase in temperature, and at least for some things, we think it's not a linear effect. So that means that getting to 4 degrees is not just twice as bad as 2 degrees, it's lots worse than 2 degrees. And this is just an example. It also shows another thing that's really important. This is meta-analysis looking at the relationship between global temperature rise and extinction risk in species. Each dot is a different study that was done using mathematical models to look at extinction risk, and the curve is the line through that huge scatter of points. And it's not a line, it's not a straight line, it's a curved line, and there's a number of biodiversity responses that look like that. 4 degrees is not just twice as bad as 2 degrees. So it'd be really good if we could stay at, well, 2 degrees, if at all possible. The other thing that this shows, and I think that's one of the really important things that we keep in mind about climate change, is there's each one of those dots is a study, and you can see how much uncertainty is there. We don't know what the future is going to look like. Some models, some of our studies suggest that the impacts of climate change could be huge. By the end of the century, they could cause the extinction of about 1/3 of all the species on the planet. And other studies suggest that the amount of extinctions caused by 3-4 degrees would be near zero. So we're headed into a situation of super high uncertainty for biodiversity related to climate change. And so we need to treat it that way. Very, very high risk is where we're headed. And so I want to talk about how we might actually solve that and actually use biodiversity as part of the solution. So after that depressing first half, we're going to go on to the more positive second half after a short pause. So maybe 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Yes, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So one of the things of great concern related to climate change is that for many species, it will reduce their population size, so it might not drive them directly extinct, but that will reduce them to such small population sizes that you'll have problems with inbreeding and other genetic drift and things like that are associated with small populations. And there's a real concern that will be driving a lot of species to small enough populations that they will then go extinct because of these difficulties, genetic difficulties and other difficulties related with small population sizes. Yep. Yeah. I hate that triangle. So go ahead. Right. Biodiversité, bien-être et climat. Right. Right. C'est très politique. Donc, so I guess I'll finish in English. I'll go to French after the break. Part of it is political. So if I live in a small country in Africa, what was my contribution to climate change? Nothing, and I'm being heavily impacted by climate change. So the developed countries screwed you, and now they want you to participate in reducing climate change. What you want is money from them to do climate change adaptation, which is a reasonably legitimate request. Biodiversity is very, very different. So some of the things that we're doing in developed countries is driving biodiversity loss in other countries, but much of the biodiversity loss is also being driven by local actions. So biodiversity is much more driven by local actions than climate change, because climate change is driven by greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So politically, they're totally different in the way that countries see the negotiations of responsibility and negotiations of who should do what in terms of acting on them. And so they don't want to confound discussions where this is one of the reasons. They don't want to confound discussions where developed countries have put a huge fraction of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and now they want everybody to participate in climate mitigation. And biodiversity issues, which are much more diffuse and national although not exclusively. That's one of the reasons that you're getting that, and that you hit on the other one, is that it's so bound up on energy use. Climate change is so tied directly to energy use, and biodiversity is being driven by so many other factors that it makes it a little bit different the way that that's being treated politically. It's hard to know. It's just crazy that the Climate Change Convention and the Biodiversity Convention can't talk to each other. And that's not that they don't want to, it's that countries don't want them to. Yeah. So that's a really good question. What should we be looking at when we talk about the biodiversity crisis? And there is a tendency to focus on extinctions. You have the Alliance for Zero Extinctions, you have the Extinction Rebellion. So there's this idea that the biodiversity crisis is very tied up with extinctions. And when you do talk about extinctions, we usually talk about extinctions of species, because that's this unique set of genes that makes something very, very special. We should be talking about population decline more. It's an incredibly important measure of biodiversity. And in many ways, the benefits that biodiversity provides for ecosystem services, so those things that biodiversity does to help people, come from the size of the populations or the biomass of populations, and not from whether they're extinct or not. So in many ways, the size of populations is a much better indicator of the state of biodiversity than extinctions. Extinctions capture people's imagination because when a species goes extinct, it really is an extreme event in biodiversity. But from a purely ecological standpoint, in most cases, it's the changes in population size that are much more important ecologically. But we also need to remember that the definition of biodiversity covers all levels of biodiversity. That's the diversity of genes within a population, the diversity of species, and the diversity of ecosystems. So even the definition that's used by the Convention on Biological Diversity, you need to remember that biodiversity is at all those levels. There's a tendency to focus on the species level because we've got lots of information there, and that's where a lot of the media attention is around the biodiversity crisis. But it's a problem. We tend to focus on species too much, and I probably just did in my lecture. Okay. It is now, let me see, 14:02. We come back at 14:10, so that's 8 minutes. And then I go to 3, is that correct? Okay, okay. I come back in French.
Hauteur.
Le
Pourcentage des
les
espèces qui
risques
s'éteindraient.
qui sont à risque d'extinction, oui.
D'accord.
Et donc, parfois, c'est 50%.
Et leur,
Donc, ça, c'est la température de l'augmentation de la planète.
oui, pardon.
4 degrés, en moyen, tu as 15% d'extinction. Avec certains modèles qui suggèrent que c'est plutôt presque 50%, d'autres 2-3%.
Oui, non, c'était pour ma question. Pourquoi les points ne font pas toucher?
C'est le nombre d'espèces. Donc, ça, c'est peut-être qu'une seule espèce, et ça, c'est une très grande nombre d'espèces qui ont été étudiées. Donc, on peut imaginer qu'un point qui est plus grand, et beaucoup plus d'espèces, c'est plus représentatif de l'impact à l'échelle globale sur la biodiversité. Bon, je vais peut-être redémarrer, s'il vous plaît. Okay. And don't hesitate. I mean, don't be afraid to say yes. Would you prefer that I did the second half in French? Up to me. Okay. I'm not sure that was unanimous, but I'll. Okay. Okay. Won't pay attention. Okay. So I'm going to look at the more positive side of things and especially look at how biodiversity can play an important role in climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And so I just want to cover a few of the things that biodiversity can do that are positive for climate change mitigation, and then I'll go to adaptation. So one of the things that we can do that's good for biodiversity and for climate change is to stop doing deforestation. So I think it's fairly obvious why that's good for biodiversity. A lot of deforestation that's going on globally is in tropical areas, Southeast Asia, Brazil, the Congo Basin, and those are some of the most biodiverse forests in the world, biodiverse ecosystems in the world. And so stopping cutting down, especially primary tropical forests, would be really good for biodiversity. What's the relationship to climate change? Maybe Valerie, yeah, go ahead. Okay, so the trees take up carbon dioxide when they do photosynthesis, and they store it, some of it, in ecosystems. So some of that gets lost again back to the atmosphere through respiration from the tree or from the soil organisms that use the carbon that the carbon fixed with photosynthesis, but a lot of it stays in the soil and stays in the trees. And when you cut it down, especially if you burn it, so in large parts of Asia, Brazil, and elsewhere, when you cut down the easiest way to get rid of a forest is to burn it. And believe it or not, tropical forest burns really well at certain areas of the year. And so in Brazil, much of the deforestation is done by burning the forest. And so not only do you not have the trees absorbing carbon anymore from the atmosphere, you're also releasing all that carbon that they stored over all that time back to the atmosphere. And so not deforesting is the fastest way to do climate mitigation. And I'll show some numbers from that. There's a huge impact we could have on climate change by just stopping deforestation. In principle, it doesn't cost much. Now, there's a lot of socioeconomic reasons why We continue to deforest, and we'll get to that, especially when we talk about food systems, but that's one of them. Another one would be to plant forests. So maybe, has anybody heard about some of the major forest planting sort of programs? Ever heard of the Bond Challenge? Yep, the Great Green Wall of the Sahel, exactly. So there's a project which has a little bit of difficulty of being implemented, but there's a project to mostly plant trees in a big band in the sub-Sahel to try and help combat desertification. Natalie knows a lot about that. She could she could add a few words about that. In fact, actually, it will get to one of my points. You have to be really careful about where you're planting trees. So you probably know about this, at least indirectly. Every time you buy something, it says, oh, we're environmentally great because you bought this, I drink Lonely Planet beer from Brewdog, and it says they're great. Every time you buy a can of beer, we'll plant a tree in someplace in Scotland or something like that. Or you get on a plane and you say, well, we compensated for this, your CO2 emissions by planting trees. So there are huge programs, and I'm getting ahead of myself. There are huge programs to plant trees. One of them is called the Bond Challenge, and the Bond Challenge is to reforest or restore forest on 350 million hectares globally, and that's being done because it has benefits for biodiversity. It's being done because it has big benefits for climate. That's probably the first reason it's being done. But it also has a lot of other benefits. Forests have a lot less soil erosion than cultivated systems, especially degraded systems. So they also bring a lot of other benefits. So forests can be, if they're planted in the right places, great. And great for biodiversity if you plant the right things. And they're great for climate for the same reasons. They suck up carbon dioxide and they store it in tree trunks and some of it in the soil. So planting trees can be a really good idea if it's done well, and that's the intelligemment part there, and I'll get back to that. But there's lots of other things. So you can also, so a lot of wetlands have been drained and destroyed, and those store huge amounts of carbon. So re-wetting those areas could actually allow them to store some of that carbon that they lost. And a really big one in agricultural systems is putting carbon in soils. So we've depleted carbon stocks in lots of soils, agricultural soils, all over the world. And that has really negative consequences for soil fertility, for soil erosion, for soil biodiversity. And restoring carbon in soils would store lots of carbon, potentially huge amounts of carbon. And most of the time when you're restoring that carbon in soils, you're also doing it in ways that would be really good for biodiversity. Yep. Yep. So how do you get carbon back in the soil? One of the easiest ways to get carbon back in the soil is put fertilizer on in as organic fertilizer as opposed to mineral fertilizer. That's one of the easiest, best ways and traditional ways of making sure that you have carbon in soils. Now there's also other ways, biochar, so taking essentially carbon and putting in the soil. Actually, that's shown some promise in increasing soil fertility, storing more carbon in soils, but it doesn't always work, and it's not obvious that it's great for biodiversity. But putting organic material on soils is great for carbon in general, and it's, in general, great for biodiversity, depending on how much you put on and what type and all those kinds of things. But done intelligently, putting organic fertilizer on instead of mineral fertilizer on is a big benefit for carbon and for biodiversity. Not the only way. there's a big debate about how much you should till soils and the effect it has. So deep plowing of soils is thought to release more carbon than no-till, so you don't plow soils at all. But I think some of our colleagues who work on that, the evidence isn't so clear on carbon storage. But it's thought that, at least by some researchers, that the way that you till soils also has a big influence on how much carbon stored. So there's actually a big program. France is actually the pilot on that program. It's called the 4 pour 1000. So it's trying to store 4 parts per, per 1,000, thank you, of carbon in soils per year. Per year, yeah. So if you could do that at global scales, it could have a huge contribution to climate change, and probably because the way you would do it would be through organic amendments largely. You would also have big benefits for biodiversity. I'll get to that a little bit later, maybe even in just a couple of slides. So how big are we talking about, peanuts in terms of climate change, or are we talking about really big potential for climate mitigation? So the number to keep in mind is that emissions from fossil fuel combustion, industry, agriculture, and agricultural, forestry, and other land uses is over 55 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. Is that right, Natalie? Yes, I'm pretty sure I took it the right place. It's a little old, that data. So that's the number to keep in mind. We're 55 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. Clearly, one of the things that we're going to have to work on, and this is not a substitute for reducing fossil fuel emissions. You can't fix climate change without significantly cutting emissions from fossil fuels. But, and this is based on a report that we just wrote for the CBD, but also from a lot of other estimates, including from the IPCC. This is pretty optimistic, but optimistically, you could store about 10 or avoid, about 10 gigatons of that just through what we call nature-based solutions. So how's that made up? So one of it's just protecting things. So mostly just stop cutting down forests, stop draining wetlands. If you don't do that, you can avoid the release of about 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. You can better manage what here is called working lands, so that's pastures and agriculture and crops mostly, and a lot of that's this 4 pour 1000, so storing carbon in agricultural systems. And there you could probably store, optimistically, about 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And you can also do restoration, planting trees, but not just only planting trees. And there you could probably store about 2 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So it's not nothing. It's not going to fix the problem. That's a really important, yep. Okay. It's not going to fix the problem. So we have to reduce fossil fuel emissions, or we're not going to get to, well, we need to be near zero emissions by 2050 if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So it's not going to fix the problem, but it is a huge part of the solution, potentially. So natural ecosystems or managed ecosystems on land can play a huge role, and protecting is good for biodiversity. Most of this better management is about things that are good for biodiversity, like better management of soils, avoid degrading ecosystems. And most of these restoration activities, if they were done right, could be good for biodiversity. So all those things are potentially good for biodiversity and good for climate. And you can look at those things and you can see how much they could contribute, and also, to a certain extent, how easy they are. So this particular graph doesn't show how much they cost, But it's comparing these kinds of different things that you could do in terms of what we call land-based solutions, in particular nature-based solutions. So reforestation can make really big contributions to natural climate solutions. That's the one up on top. That's good for biodiversity if it's done right. Avoided forest conversion, again, that's almost always good. Better management in natural forests, that's better. Improving plantations, getting away from monocultures, managing the soils better. You can just go down this list, and just about everything on this list is good for climate and good for biodiversity. So there's just lots of things that we can do that are good for both. So we ought to really try and be deploying these things at global scales. So that's one point. Another point is related to restoration. And actually, right now, I just finished a report for the Convention on Biological Diversity on restoration. And we're trying to estimate the effects that restoration could have on biodiversity and, to a certain extent, on climate change. So this is a study that was published a couple of years ago. And what they found, based on a mathematical model, is that if you took about 15% of converted lands, so what's a converted land? So a converted land is a degraded agricultural land, or in some cases even productive agricultural land, or badly degraded forests. And if you took them and you restored them towards a more natural system, they estimate, based on mathematical models, that you could avoid about 60% of extinctions that we would be expecting based on the decline in the size of populations. And you could sequester about 300 gigatons of CO2. Now, remembering that we're emitting about 55, 60 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that's a lot. So that's just showing the potential for restoration of ecosystems, especially of converted lands, so taking degraded agricultural lands and trying to restore them back to natural lands could have a huge effect. And there are places where that's going on. So in the Loess Plateau of China, which you can't see very well, but it's sort of in the northern part of China, towards the Mongolian border, they've been doing that at very, very large scales. So essentially, they've been paying farmers. So it was an area with very badly degraded pastures, and they've been just paying farmers not to pasture anymore. And that's done an incredibly good job of bringing back both biodiversity, reducing soil erosion, reducing flooding, and storing carbon. So that's one example. In the South Atlantic forests of Brazil, which are on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, a little bit southern part of Brazil, one of the most richest biodiversity-rich tropical forests in the world, badly degraded through deforestation. They've got a huge program to reforest that with native tree species, high diversity mixtures of tree species over very, very large scales. And again, it's the same thing. Lots of carbon stored. The first tests show that it really does an incredibly good job of bringing biodiversity back, and it avoids things like soil erosion, flash flooding, mudslides, and actually was initiated after hundreds of people were killed by mudslides in Brazil due to badly degraded lands that had been deforested. So this shows some really interesting potential. Governments are currently negotiating this, and at the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, so it's not just the IPCC that has COPs. Biodiversity also has their own conferences of the parties, which will happen in December of this year. They will decide on how much ambition they want to do this kind of thing. And what we're trying to do is provide scientific evidence showing that doing this kind of thing would be great for biodiversity and for climate change. Yes? So, actually, as part of the work that we're doing for the CBD, we just did a review of that. And so there have been a number of recent reviews of how long it takes to restore ecosystems. And it's highly, as you can imagine, it's highly ecosystem dependent. And it's highly dependent on how badly it was disturbed and degraded before you're doing restoration. Typically, it takes at least a decade. More often, it takes many decades, if not many centuries. So it takes to get to, well, actually, in most cases, you never get to full restoration. So to think that you can get back to something that's essentially identical to the natural ecosystem that was destroyed in the first place, it's really, really hard to achieve that. But to get to something close, it usually takes somewhere between a decade and a few centuries. No, the 300 gigatons, so the biodiversity is going to take longer to come back than the amount of carbon you're storing. Actually, if you plant trees, you're actually storing more carbon per year in younger stands than you are in older stands. So you're actually putting more carbon into the system in younger stands and older stands in general. Yeah. That's a good point. Oh, I'm embarrassed. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely 100%. Yes. So you're absolutely right, but I don't know what over period. No. I don't. It can't be per year, but I don't know. Yeah, but I don't know if it's between now and 2030 or 2050 or whether it's the whole lifetime of the forest. Yeah. No. Wait. Clearly, I will look at that paper. Just guessing, I would think it's between now and 2050 or something like that, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I shouldn't say I don't know, and I will look at that in my paper. It's embarrassing that I didn't write that, actually. Yeah. Especially since we just finished that review just a little while ago. I don't remember. Yeah. And worse than that, I have a colleague who told me that those calculations are wrong. So, yes, I know it's not per year. But an expert that I know quite well, Almut Arnett, told me that the numbers are all wrong. So maybe I shouldn't even put those numbers up there, but yeah. You can store a lot of carbon. And this gets to the thing that we were discussing earlier, storing carbon in soils. And this is actually a project that's going on the Saclay Plateau with colleagues here that either already are or soon will be, also in labs here on the Saclay Plateau at our university. So one of the interesting things you can do in terms of both biodiversity, well-being, human well-being, and climate change is to work on soil biodiversity and soil carbon. So this is just a little slide that I took from a European Union diagram that soils are the factory of life. And that's because when you've got living soils, they can produce a lot of their own nutrients. So they're degrading organic material and they're producing nitrogen and phosphorus, which is necessary for the growth of plants. They're stabilizing soils to reduce soil erosion. Those are all these things down here, and storing more carbon. So typically, putting things like organic material on soils can be really beneficial for biodiversity, climate change, and lots of ecosystem services. And one of the interesting problems we have here in this area is there's not enough organic material to go around, and so at least from animals. And so the question is, if you're not getting it from animals, where do you get it from? And so we have one of the things to do is that where we live here is a very open system. So export lots of agricultural material and import lots of fertilizer and all those things that you need to grow the energy, to grow the plants. And what we're thinking about is, how do you make that system more self-sufficient? And that could make it perhaps more robust. That we don't actually know for 100% sure, but at least it builds a much stronger social tissue. So one of the ideas is to use other sources of organic material and working on the whole diversity of organic materials that could potentially be used in agriculture to look at how well they do in terms of doing all these good things for biodiversity, climate change, and soil fertility and soil erosion. And basically, the response is you can do a lot. One of them, which probably is the most sexy thing that you can do, is actually collecting urine and using urine as fertilizer could be a really great way. It's not going to put a lot of carbon in ecosystems, but it could be a really great way to avoid using mineral fertilizers. So maybe one day your urine will be collected and used in the farms, for better or worse, nearby. The other one, we've already talked about hedges, so I don't think we're going to talk more about hedges. Yep. À l'échelle locale. So it's been shown for a lot of reasons that integrated farming has a lot of advantages. And what's integrated farming? Integrated farming means that you have animals and growing crops on the same farm. And so there you're really talking at the very local scale, this interaction, and that it goes beyond just having manure for fertilizing soils. But there are lots of reasons to think, even not just at the level of the Saclay Plateau or the whole region of the Paris region, even at the scale of individual farms, there's lots of reasons to go towards more internal cycling. And so that question doesn't have an easy response. Certainly, let's take the French scale. Does it make sense that we have way too many pigs in Brittany and they're being fed with crops that are coming from elsewhere? That's just creating all kinds of problems. And so clearly at the size of the country, dividing where you grow crops and where you have livestock is the wrong scale. So, even at the scale of farm, it could be good. At the scale of a country, I'm not familiar enough with evidence to say it's not the best scale to do it, but it would strike me as not the appropriate scale to be doing, to call that local scale. Hedges, we had a little discussion about hedges during the break, about why people rip hedges out and why we're putting them back in. It is interesting. There is a hedge planting program that's going on here on the Saclay Plateau. What's interesting, and I didn't know this, I've got a history book on the Saclay Plateau. Most of the hedges in France were ripped out after World War II. On the Saclay Plateau, they ripped them out long time ago. So if you go back and you look at historical photographs of the Saclay Plateau, actually they did that a long, long time ago. The interesting thing is that they're putting them back in, and that could have all kinds of benefits, but it's interesting working with the farmers on that. What we know is that it's not that straightforward. They're worried about how they're going to maintain the hedges, who's going to plant them, whether they're going to get birds and insects that actually aren't helpful for agricultural systems in them. So hedges are great for biodiversity, but they're complicated socially and economically. And one of the things that I didn't talk about, and I have not talked about adaptation anywhere nearly enough, and I think I'm not going to talk about it enough. One of the things that biodiversity can do is also help with adaptation. And in the IPC IPBES report, we talk about a lot about how biodiversity can be good for adaptation. I'll just give one good example. What we know is that big, genetically uniform crops or tree stands tend to be at higher risk of damage from climate change than more diverse. And that's something that you're seeing this year in France. Huge areas of dead monocultures of conifer forests. Corn did really bad this year. Farmers in France and in Europe and the world in general have greatly reduced the diversity of their crops, and that could have really negative consequences for their ability to adapt to climate change. And one of the things that are really pushing in agricultural systems is to diversify both genetically the crops that you're growing and diversify the variety, different species of crops that you're growing. And one of the really great examples is one of the groups here in the EDEV laboratory where I'm located is actually working on a program where they work with farmers. And instead of farmers buying their seeds and planting genetically uniform crops, they actually take their own seeds, they sow the seeds, they recover the seeds, especially from the plants that grew the best, and then they replant those seeds, and then on and on and on. And the idea is then that you're adapting your genetic background based on climate as it changes. So, and I'll get to you in just a second. So the idea is that farmers themselves are naturally selecting the varieties of crops that are best adapted to climate change. Interestingly, that was seen as something completely heretical even a decade ago, and is now really gaining a lot of ground as a way that people could actually increase their capacity for climate adaptation. On a more perhaps easy to apply basis on a countrywide level, just growing a wider variety of crops and a greater diversity of genetic types of crops would be a big benefit in terms of climate change adaptation. Yeah. Uh-huh. It's very complicated. It has been now changed. So the law has been not changed, but tweaked a bit. So you're not allowed to sell your seeds as crops. So there's always been a law that you could, that people could have their garden and they could collect their own seeds and they could replant their own seeds. So you can do that, and that law has been kind of massaged so that can then apply to people who are growing wheat and things like that. But as far as I don't know if anybody in the room knows, it's evolved actually fairly well. It didn't evolve for very, very quickly for a long time, but it's evolved a little bit over the recent past, so that it's a little easier to get away with that than it was in the past. But the point is really good. You can't register it, and since you can't register it, that creates all kinds of restrictions on using it. And there are reasons. Well, yeah. So the same applies to forests. There was a great program on TV last night about the way that forests are being managed in France. Growing a lot of monocultures, especially of conifers, having all kinds of problems with them, and the Office National de Forêt is now moving towards the idea that climate change is going to pose problems, and you're not going to respond to that just by growing genetically identical stands of species. And so thinking about having mixed stands, so you'd be growing many different tree species in the same stand. There's not a lot of that, or mostly not just having like the area near Bordeaux, the Landes, is basically just Pan Maritime. It's just this enormous, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest single forest in Europe. And it's basically just monospecific stands of Pan Maritime. And that's posing all kinds of problems, and people are beginning to have second thoughts about that, in particular related to climate change, and particularly this year related to fires. So what are the kinds of things, so those are the good things that can happen. So maybe let's think about some of the things that you could do to mitigate or attenuate climate change that would not be so great for biodiversity. One of them is bioenergy. So bioenergy at small scales can be very good, can help replace some fossil fuels. Sometimes economically it can be very useful, but at very large scales, it's a disaster for biodiversity, because where do you grow bioenergy? Well, a lot of times you cut down primary forest or destroy natural areas, wetlands, grow bioenergy. The other thing that poses a problem is this idea of planting trees. Not all those trees are getting planted in places where you should be planting them. So when I buy my beer that says they're going to plant a tree, at least they tell me where they're planting the tree. Lots of times when they tell you they plant a tree for you, you have no idea where they're planting a tree. And sometimes that tree is planted in what is naturally a grassland. And that's a really bad idea. Sometimes they're planting non-native tree species in monocultures, in monospecific stands, which from a biodiversity perspective is typically not great. So that can be a problem. And then there's tons of stuff that's going on in terms of climate adaptation that could be problems. So what do you do if you have problems like we did this year with lack of water for agriculture? You build small reservoirs, you build dams, and you increase your irrigation capacity. And that's exactly what France is doing. Yeah. Yep. Yes. So the map I showed you of restoration was not a map of reforestation. It was a map of restoration. So some of that is restoring forest, and some of that was non-forest. So there have been some other maps that have been published for the possibility to reforest. Unfortunately, a major article that came out in Science with those maps suggested that we should plant trees in areas that were natively grasslands. It was a very, very controversial article, unfortunately, that many governments have paid attention to, and is taking a long time to get people to rethink. So essentially they were saying plant trees everywhere and we can fix the climate problem. Really, really, it's a really great example of scientists doing an incredible amount of harm. And science that, the journal Science that should have known better. Yeah. Yes. Yep. That's a tricky one, yep. Yep. Yeah. So one of the biggest issues in restoration ecology is how much should we be anticipating climate change? There's no sense in restoring a system to exactly what it is now if we know that climate change is going to pose problems for that in the future. And that's a really, really tricky problem, but one that we need to take into account when we're doing restoration. France, for example, instead of digging holes everywhere and putting water in it, which they say is only just water that would have run off anyway during the winter, and it turns out actually in some places they're actually pumping groundwater to fill them up. Instead of digging reservoirs everywhere, maybe we should be growing crops that need less water. So if you're interested in this, there's a really long list of different kinds of climate adaptation. Now, some climate adaptation measures are really interesting for biodiversity. And some of them, we need to combine what we call some hard engineered measures with biodiversity measures. So, for example, for coastal defenses, just building seawalls, especially if we're just trying to avoid property loss, may not be the best thing to do. But sometimes it really is necessary, even to preserve biodiversity, to combine dune restoration with some hard defenses of coastal systems so that you can actually preserve the biodiversity and not just property. But coastal seawalls are a great example of climate adaptation. There are a lot of countries that are going to have to build some sort of coastal defense as sea level rises. Now, in some cases, it might be very effective mostly to do that through dune reinforcement or tactical retreat. So just leaving those things that were built too close to the ocean in the first place, and then leaving those free to be colonized to be restored to more natural systems. But many places, they're just going to build hard coastal defenses. So this was just a slide to say things that I've already said. There are these huge tree planting programs. So countries, for example, have committed to, planting 1 billion trees. Well, that's part of it. So there's the Bonn Challenge. So that's planting this 350 million hectares of trees. Just learned yesterday that there's actually a big flaw with this study, but basically what we can say is that a very large fraction of the way that countries are actually going to meet that challenge is through planting non-native trees. So Brazil is planting eucalyptus plantations, so they're taking non-native trees, planting eucalyptus trees in Brazil and saying they're restoring ecosystems. Now, that might store some carbon, true, but from a biodiversity perspective, it's a complete catastrophe. And then part of this, and that's good, is agroforestry. So a large fraction is actually agroforestry. Agroforestry is growing trees along with crops. For example, when that's done with coffee or chocolate, actually that can make those systems much more sustainable. But it's not a solution you can apply everywhere, and it doesn't always have real positive effects for biodiversity, although it frequently is good for biodiversity. And actually, it's only about 1/3 of it that's actually restoring natural forest. So about the 200 million hectares of commitments that are made, a big fraction of that is not going to be all that great for biodiversity. Some of it will be, yeah. So what's the risk of planting eucalyptus in Brazil, for example? So the risk there, first of all, Oh, it's a long list. So first of all, eucalyptus trees are full of oils and other kinds of toxins for most species in their leaves. And so there's basically nothing outside of Australia that can digest them. So essentially what you're doing is you're creating an ecosystem that's a biological desert in places where species haven't adapted to them. The second thing that you're doing, and the Portuguese have found out, and that is that they burn really, really, really well. And so the fires the really, really big fires that we had in Portugal, a large fraction of that was actually eucalyptus plantations that were burning. So they're full of oils and they just burn really, really, really well. There are lots of reasons why it would just be a lot better to grow at least native tree species and, if possible, mixtures of tree species. The other risk, well, with eucalyptus, it's actually relatively low because you harvest them so fast. The other risk is that you've got species you've got these huge stands of species that are all identical, and if there's either an insect pest or a climate event that's negative for them, you lose the whole thing. And that's one of the problems with both crop monocultures and tree monocultures, is that if you're really planting over these really large areas and then something goes wrong, then you're in trouble. And it even creates the situation that will make the propagation of those problems greater. So, for example, these really big monoculture pine plantations in the Landes, you have a number of risks that are associated with that. First of all, when you get windstorms, you have uniform-sized trees, and they just fall like dominoes. So when we had the windstorms in France in 1999, it just knocked them down like bowling pins. Another thing that happens is when you get insect infestations, because every tree is genetically identical, the insects are well adapted to that, and they can just move from tree to tree to tree to tree without anything that's unfavorable to their movement. And when you get fires, it's the same thing. You've just got this uniform system that fire can just burn through. And so, the lawn is just a really great example of lots of the really bad things that can happen when you grow monocultures. So why do people do it? Because it's easy to manage. So you come in there, you've got pine trees, they've got nice, great, big, straight trunks. You come in with a great big machine that goes glomp, it cuts the tree trunk, it strips all the limbs off it, you stuff it in a pile, it goes to a place where you can cut it up in logs. Every single tree trunk is exactly the same size, and they go juk, 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 and you've got your lumber. That's why you grow tree monocultures. And I mean, that's not a bad reason. Economically, it makes a lot of sense. As long as things don't go wrong, economically, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So they actually dried the soil as well. So they also they created ditches everywhere else as well to help drain the soil. So yeah, you had to grow trees there that were adapted to the kinds of soils that were there. And you had soils that were well adapted to maritime pine. So it was a good tree species to choose to work with that particular soil in that particular environment. Could you have mixed that in with other trees? They're trying to do that right now, and they have. So yeah, you can grow other trees there. You don't just have to grow maritime pine. So let's be realistic. This isn't going to happen everywhere in the world that you don't grow tree monocultures. There are lots of good economic reasons to have tree monocultures, and we'll keep having tree monocultures. But to start planting even more things like eucalyptus plantations in Brazil and call that restoration, is another thing. If you want to call it eucalyptus plantations so that you're growing biomass or pulpwood, then call it that. Doing in terms of time. Oh, I'm past time. Wow. Oh. So I can't talk anymore. I'm done. So I'll give you my slides, and you can have a look at it, because I didn't get to talk about food systems, and that really disappoints me because I didn't talk about it. But I think you've heard enough from me for today, and so I'd like to thank you all, and know if you have any questions before if I have time to answer a few questions.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. Okay. If you've got a... So I'll summarize it in one sentence. So basically, food systems, so agriculture and fisheries, are the primary cause of biodiversity loss. They're also one of the primary drivers of climate change. And so if we change what we eat, and I'm not talking about all becoming vegetarian, if we change what we eat, we can have a huge influence on biodiversity and climate change. So food systems are probably one of the most important ways that we can have positive effects on biodiversity and climate change. There, thanks. Thank you all very much.